There's a leather journal in the Alabama State Archives that no one was allowed to read for 127 years. When historians finally opened it in 1974, 3 of them requested immediate transfers to different departments. The journal belonged to a doctor who'd been called to a plantation outside Selma in 1847, and what he documented there was so disturbing that he wrote on the first page, "May God forgive me for not burning this. But someone must know what I witnessed, even if that knowledge comes a century after my death." The plantation was called Willowmere. The woman who owned it was named Elizabeth Crane, and what she created there wasn't just slavery, it was something worse, something that turned the already obscene logic of human bondage into a calculated nightmare that destroyed everyone it touched, including her own children. In 1847, on the banks of the Alabama River, Elizabeth Crane was orchestrating a breeding program that used her own sons as instruments. She kept meticulous records. She tracked bloodlines like a horse breeder. She separated families, forced unions between blood relatives, and built a system so methodical that even other plantation owners whispered about it in horrified fascination. But they never stopped her, because in Alabama in 1847, enslaved people weren't human beings under the law. They were property, and what you did with your property was your own business. What makes this story particularly haunting is that Elizabeth Crane wasn't some sadistic monster who enjoyed cruelty. She was worse than that. She was a businesswoman who saw human beings as inventory, who calculated profit in children's lives, and who convinced herself that what she was doing was not just acceptable, but innovative. She called it improvement. She called it efficiency. She called it the future of Southern agriculture. What she never called it was what it actually was. A crime against humanity so profound that the very earth at Willowmere seemed cursed by it. Before we go deeper into this darkness, understand something. This isn't entertainment, this is testimony. These were real people who suffered in ways that should make us sick to remember. And if you're still here, if you're willing to witness what happened at Willowmere Plantation, then you need to hear all of it. The comfortable lies we tell ourselves about history require the truth as their antidote. Subscribe if you believe that remembering is an act of resistance. Share this if you understand that forgetting the dead means killing them twice. The story begins not with Elizabeth Crane, but with her husband's death, and with the debt he left behind that would cost dozens of people their lives and their humanity. Willowmere Plantation occupied 8,400 acres along the Alabama River, about 12 miles south of Selma in Dallas County. The land was good black soil that grew cotton, like the river itself was pumping wealth directly into the ground. Colonel Marcus Crane had purchased the property in 1809 with money inherited from his father's shipping business in Savannah. By 1825, Willowmere was producing 340 bales of cotton annually, and Marcus Crane was one of the most respected planters in Dallas County. He married Elizabeth Thornton in 1821. She was 17 years old, the daughter of a failed banker from Montgomery who'd lost everything in the panic of 1819. The marriage was strategic on both sides. Marcus needed a wife to manage his household and produce heirs. Elizabeth needed escape from poverty and the social death that came with her father's bankruptcy. They made a practical arrangement, and for 20 years it functioned adequately, if not warmly. Elizabeth bore Marcus 6 children between 1822 and 1835. 3 survived infancy. 2 sons, Jonathan born in 1823, and Samuel born in 1826, and 1 daughter Mary born in 1830. The children were raised in the rigid formality of plantation aristocracy. They learned French from a hired tutor. They studied scripture under their father's supervision. They understood from earliest childhood that they were superior to the enslaved people who surrounded them, not because of any personal merit, but simply because God had ordained it that way. At least that's what they were told. Marcus Crane died in February 1842. He'd been riding the property line when his horse stumbled in a gully. Marcus fell, struck his head on a rock, and never regained consciousness. He was 58 years old. The funeral was well attended. Neighboring planters spoke warmly of his integrity, his business acumen, his devotion to the Southern way of life. They offered Elizabeth their support and assistance. They assured her that managing Willowmere would be challenging, but that with proper guidance from male relatives or a competent overseer, she would manage. What none of them knew, what Elizabeth herself didn't fully understand until the lawyer read Marcus's will, Ray was drowning in debt. Marcus had borrowed extensively to expand his L and holdings in the late 1830s. He'd purchased additional enslaved people on credit. He'd made investments in Alabama railroads that had collapsed spectacularly. On paper, Willowere was worth $87,000. But Marcus owed $52,000 to creditors in Mobile and New Orleans, with notes coming due over the next 4 years. Elizabeth sat in the lawyer's office in Selma, listening to numbers that represented catastrophe. She was 38 years old, a widow with 3 children, and a plantation that was essentially collateral for debts she had no way to pay. Selling Willowere would barely cover what was owed. She'd be left with nothing, no home, no income, no social standing, just poverty and dependence on whatever relatives might take pity on her. The lawyer, a thin man named Horace Peen, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mrs. Crane," he said, "there may be options. If you could increase production significantly, pay down the notes as they come due, you might retain ownership, but that would require substantial increases in output without additional capital investment. It would require," he paused, "maximum efficiency from your existing resources." Elizabeth understood what he meant. She needed to make her enslaved population more productive without buying additional workers. She needed to extract more labor, more value, more profit from the 63 people Marcus had owned. The 63 people she now owned, and she needed to grow that number without spending money on purchases. There was only one way to do that: breeding. Most plantations experienced what owners called natural increase. Enslaved women had children. Those children eventually became workers. It was slow, but over decades it grew the labor force. But Elizabeth didn't have decades. She had 4 years before the largest note came due. She needed rapid increase, systematic increase. She needed to turn reproduction into an industrial process. The idea didn't come to her fully formed. It developed over months as she studied the plantation ledgers. As she calculated profit margins, as she lay awake at night doing arithmetic that traded human dignity for financial survival, she began tracking the women at Willowmere, noting their ages, their health, their fertility. She separated out the youngest and strongest 11 women ranging from age 16 to 24. She moved them into a renovated cabin near the main house where she could supervise them directly. And then she looked at her sons. Jonathan was 19 years old in 1842, tall and lean with his father's serious demeanor. Samuel was 16, more volatile, quicker to anger. Both were young men of marriageable age in a community where eligible young women were scarce and required dowies Elizabeth couldn't afford. Both were bound to Willowere by circumstance and family obligation. Both were, she realized, with cold calculation, tools she could use. The first conversation happened in September 1842. Elizabeth called Jonathan into her study, the room where Marcus had once managed plantation business. She'd been managing it herself for 6 months by then, learning to read ledgers to calculate yields, to make decisions about crop rotation and slave discipline. She discovered she was good at it, perhaps better than Marcus had been. She had a clarity he'd lacked. She wasn't sentimental about tradition or reputation. She focused on results. "Jonathan," she said, closing the ledger she'd been reviewing, "we need to discuss the future of Willowmere. You understand our financial situation?" Jonathan nodded. His mother had been frank with him about the debt. He knew they were in danger of losing everything. "I've been considering how to increase our holdings without capital expenditure," Elizabeth continued. "The most efficient method is to grow our labor force through natural reproduction. But the natural rate is too slow. We need to accelerate it." She watched her son's face carefully as understanding dawned. Jonathan's expression shifted from confusion to comprehension to something that looked like physical illness. "Mother," he said slowly, "are you suggesting that we—" She cut him off. "I'm suggesting that you understand your duty to this family, that you recognize the reality of our situation, that you participate in ensuring our survival. The women I've selected are healthy and fertile. The children they bear will belong to Willowere, will increase our wealth, will secure our future." Jonathan stood up abruptly. "This is obscene. It's wrong. Father would never have allowed it." "Your father is dead." Elizabeth's voice hardened. "Your father left us in debt. Your father's traditional methods were leading us toward bankruptcy. I'm doing what's necessary to save this family, and you will help me, or you'll watch your sister starve when creditors take everything we own." The argument continued for hours, but Elizabeth Crane had already won. She knew her son's weak points, his sense of family duty, his fear of poverty, his lack of alternatives. Jonathan was 19. Yea, arse old with no education beyond plantation life, No money of his own, no prospects beyond what Willowmere could provide. He was trapped, and his mother knew it. By October 1842, Jonathan Crane had entered the cabin where Elizabeth kept her selected women. He'd been assigned to a girl named Celia, 18 years old, born at Willowmere, strong from fieldwork. Celia had been given no choice in the matter. She'd been told that compliance meant better food, lighter work, safety for what family she had left. Resistance meant punishment, separation from her younger sister, possible sale to the deep south, where death came quickly in the cane fields. What happened in that cabin wasn't consent. It wasn't romance. It wasn't even the common brutality of masters taking enslaved women by force. It was something more coldly evil. It was organized, scheduled, recorded in ledgers with the same notation Elizabeth used for cotton yields and equipment maintenance. Jonathan came to the cabin 3 nights each week. Elizabeth tracked Celia's cycles to maximize chances of conception. When Celia became pregnant in December, Elizabeth noted it with satisfaction and moved Jonathan to the next woman on her list, a 20-year-old named Ruth. Samuel was brought into the system in early 1843. He was younger than Jonathan, more easily manipulated, and secretly relieved to have access to women without the social complications of courtship. Elizabeth recognized this about her younger son and used it. She presented the breeding program not as a moral compromise, but as a privilege, a natural right of ownership that he should exercise without guilt. Samuel accepted this narrative more readily than Jonathan ever had. Within 6 months, he'd fathered children with 3 different women. By the end of 1843, Elizabeth's system was fully operational. The selected women lived in the supervised cabin. Jonathan and Samuel rotated among them on schedules Elizabeth maintained in her private ledger. Pregnancies were monitored carefully. Women received better food during pregnancy, lighter work, access to the plantation's medical supplies. These incentives weren't kindness. They were Elizabeth's investment in inventory. A healthy baby was worth $400 by age 12. A dead infant was just a loss of capital. The horror of Willowmere wasn't just in what Elizabeth did to the enslaved women, though that was horror enough. It was in how she corrupted her own sons, turning them into instruments of systematic rape, destroying whatever capacity for moral resistance they might have possessed. Jonathan began drinking heavily by 1844. He performed his assigned duties in the breeding program, but withdrew from all other aspects of plantation life. He rarely spoke at meals. He avoided his mother's eyes. He moved through Willowmere like a ghost, present but absent, alive but already dead inside. Samuel went in a different direction. He embraced the brutality. He convinced himself that enslaved women were fundamentally different from white women, that what he did in the cabin wasn't violation because his victims weren't fully human. This lie protected him from guilt, but made him dangerous. He began taking women outside the official program, forcing himself on field workers, ignoring his mother's schedules in favor of his own impulses. Elizabeth tried to rein him in, not from moral concern, but from fear that his lack of control would create complications. But Samuel was learning what every enslaver eventually learned. Once you accept that some human beings are property, once you internalize that logic, there are no real limits to the cruelty you'll justify. There was a woman named Bethany who watched all of this unfold. She was 32 years old in 1843, had been at Willowmere since childhood, worked in the main house as a cook. Bethany couldn't read or write, but she had a sharp mind and a remarkable memory. She remembered which women were taken to the cabin and when. She remembered which children were born and who their fathers were. She remembered the conversation she overheard when Elizabeth thought the enslaved people around her were too ignorant to understand what was being discussed. Bethany began keeping mental records, building a testimony in her mind because written testimony was impossible. She noted dates and details. She memorized names. She created a structure of memory that would survive even if she didn't because she understood something fundamental. This evil needed witnesses. Someone needed to remember what happened at Willowmere, even if that memory had to be carried silently for years, even if justice seemed impossible. The act of remembering was itself a form of resistance, a refusal to let the horror be normalized and forgotten. In the spring of 1844, a girl named Sarah was selected for Elizabeth's program. She was 16 years old, and her selection broke something in the enslaved community at Willowmere. Sarah was the daughter of Jacob, a blacksmith who'd been at the plantation for 20 years. Jacob had some small status among the enslaved people. He was skilled, valuable, treated marginally better than field hands. When Elizabeth's overseer came for Sarah, Jacob made a choice that would alter everything. He refused. Jacob's refusal came on a Tuesday morning in April 1844. The overseer, a man named Garrett Mills, had arrived at the blacksmith shop where Jacob was repairing tools for the spring planting. Mills told Jacob that Sarah was needed at the main house. Jacob understood what that meant. Everyone at Willowmere understood what it meant when young women were summoned to the main house and didn't return until morning. Jacob set down his hammer. He was a large man, his arms thick with muscle from years of forge work. He looked at Mills with an expression that contained everything he'd swallowed for 2 decades. Rage, grief, exhaustion, and something harder, something that looked like a decision being made in real time. "No," Jacob said quietly. "She ain't going." Mills stared at him. "What did you say?" "I said no." Jacob's voice remained calm, but his hands had curled into fists. "Sarah's my daughter. She's a child, and I ain't letting you take her to be used like that. I don't care what Mistress Crane wants. I don't care what you do to me. The answer is no." For a long moment, Mills seemed genuinely shocked. Enslaved people didn't refuse direct orders. The entire system depended on compliance enforced by the certain knowledge of brutal punishment for resistance. Jacob's refusal was more than disobedience. It was a challenge to the fundamental logic of slavery itself. Mills reached for the whip he carried at his belt. Jacob grabbed a poker from the forge, iron still glowing red at one end. The 2 men faced each other in the doorway of the blacksmith's shop, both understanding that whatever happened next would be irreversible. Other enslaved people had gathered, drawn by the commotion. They watched in silence, frozen between hope and terror. Mills saw the crowd and recognized his disadvantage. One man with a whip against a blacksmith with a weapon and witnesses. He backed away slowly. "This ain't over," he said. "Mistress Crane will hear about this." Jacob knew what was coming. There were no victories for enslaved people, only choices about how to lose. He bought Sarah some time, maybe hours, maybe a day. But Elizabeth Crane wouldn't tolerate defiance. The punishment would be severe, designed to terrify anyone else who might consider resistance. Jacob accepted this. Some things were worth dying for. Your child's innocence was one of them. Elizabeth learned about the incident within an hour. Her reaction was cold calculation rather than anger. Jacob's refusal represented a direct threat to her system. If one person could resist successfully, others would follow. She needed to make an example so brutal that no one at Willowmere would ever consider defiance again. But she also needed to be careful. Jacob was valuable. He was the only blacksmith at Willowmere, and blacksmiths were difficult to replace. Killing him would create practical problems. She needed punishment that would break him without destroying his usefulness, that would terrify the other enslaved people without reducing her labor force. She called Jonathan into her study that evening. "Your involvement is required," she told him. "There's been an incident, a refusal. It needs to be addressed publicly and severely." Jonathan looked at his mother with hollow eyes. "What do you want me to do?" She handed him a document. "It's a bill of sale. You're going to tell Jacob that his daughter will be sold to a slave trader heading to Louisiana. You're going to make him watch as she's loaded into a wagon. And then after he's had time to understand what his defiance cost, you're going to inform him that the sale can be canceled if he apologizes publicly and ensures his daughter's compliance with our program." Jonathan stared at the paper in his hands. "Mother, it's necessary," Elizabeth interrupted. "Either we maintain control or we lose everything. You understand that, don't you? The alternative to discipline is chaos. The alternative to our system is bankruptcy and ruin. Now do as I say." The performance happened the next morning. The entire enslaved population of Willowmere was assembled in the yard between the main house and the slave quarters. Elizabeth stood on the porch, Jonathan beside her, Mills and 2 other white men positioned strategically around the crowd. Sarah stood near the main house crying, barely understanding what was happening. Jacob was brought forward in chains. Mills had secured him the previous night, locked him in the barn to prevent escape or further resistance. Now he stood in front of the assembled crowd, his face expressionless, his body rigid with suppressed emotion. Jonathan read from a prepared statement, his voice mechanical. "Jacob has refused a direct order from the mistress of Willowmere. Such refusal cannot be tolerated. As punishment, his daughter Sarah will be sold immediately to a trader bound for New Orleans. She will leave this plantation within the hour." A woman in the crowd, Sarah's mother, collapsed. Other women caught her before she hit the ground. The sound of her grief was animal, wordless, absolute. Jacob's face remained expressionless, but tears ran down his cheeks in steady streams. Elizabeth let the moment breathe. She let the horror settle over the assembled people. She let them understand what defiance cost. Then she spoke for the first time. However, she said, her voice carrying across the silent crowd. I'm a merciful woman. If Jacob apologizes publicly, if he acknowledges his error, if he personally ensures his daughter's compliance with her assigned duties, then the sale will be canceled. Sarah will remain at Willowmere with her family. The choice is his. Every person in that yard understood what Elizabeth was doing. She was forcing Jacob to choose between his daughter's sale to the hell of Louisiana sugar plantations or her participation in the breeding program he tried to prevent. She was making him complicit in his own defeat, making him the instrument of his daughter's violation. It was cruelty refined to its purest form. Jacob looked at Sarah. She was 16 years old, terrified, crying. Louisiana meant death within years. Worked to exhaustion in cane fields, where life expectancy for enslaved people averaged 7 years after arrival. Willowmere meant violation, but survival. It meant she'd remain near family. It meant she might live long enough to see freedom, if freedom ever came. Jacob broke. He dropped to his knees in front of Elizabeth Crane and spoke the words she required. I apologize for my disobedience. I was wrong. I will ensure my daughter's compliance. Please allow her to remain at Willowmere. Elizabeth accepted his apology with gracious condescension. Sarah was not sold. That evening, she was taken to the supervised cabin. Jonathan was assigned to her, a final cruelty that forced Jacob to know exactly who was violating his daughter and when. Within 2 months, Sarah was pregnant. Within a year, she'd borne Jonathan's child, a light-skinned boy that Elizabeth named Thomas and valued at $450 in her ledgers. Jacob never recovered. He continued working in the blacksmith shop, but something essential had died in him. Other enslaved people at Willowmere understood what they'd witnessed. Resistance was futile. Elizabeth Crane had demonstrated that she could take everything, that she would use love itself as a weapon, that there was no limit to the cruelty she would deploy to maintain control. The system expanded after Jacob's broken rebellion. Elizabeth grew more confident, more brazen. By 1845, the supervised cabin held 18 women. Jonathan and Samuel had fathered 23 children between them. Elizabeth's ledgers showed these children as assets, projected their future value, calculated the return on her investment in better food and medical care for pregnant women. She'd successfully monetized rape, turned violation into profit, and created a self-perpetuating system that grew her wealth while requiring minimal capital expenditure. But Elizabeth wasn't satisfied with simple expansion. She began experimenting with controlled breeding among the children from her program. When the oldest girls reached puberty, she started planning their futures, matching them with boys based on desired characteristics. She was thinking in generations now, designing a multi-generational program that would create a distinctive population at Willowmere. People of mixed race trained from birth for skilled work, more valuable than field hands, more controllable than purchased workers who remembered freedom. There was a doctor named Nathaniel Morrison who served several plantations in Dallas County. He visited Willowmere regularly to treat sick workers, to supervise childbirth, to provide the minimal medical care that plantation owners invested in to protect their property. Morrison was 47 years old in 1847, originally from Pennsylvania, who'd moved south for economic opportunity and gradually accommodated himself to slavery's realities through a series of moral compromises that he justified as necessary pragmatism. But what he saw at Willowmere shocked him. Morrison had witnessed plenty of horror in his years serving plantations. He treated enslaved people beaten nearly to death. He delivered babies fathered by masters on enslaved women. He'd seen families separated on auction blocks. The brutality of slavery was familiar to him, and he'd learned to function within it by convincing himself that he was merely treating symptoms of a disease he couldn't cure. Willowmere was different. The level of organization, the systematic nature of Elizabeth's breeding program, the clinical record-keeping, the involvement of her own sons, it all combined into something that exceeded even slavery's normal horror. Hen Elizabeth showed him her ledgers, proud of her efficiency, explaining her multi-generational breeding plans. Morrison felt physically ill. He said nothing to Elizabeth. What could he say? She wasn't breaking any laws. Enslaved people were property. What owners did with their property was legally irrelevant. But that night, in the room Elizabeth provided for his stay, Morrison did something he'd never done before. He started keeping detailed notes about what he'd witnessed. He wrote about the supervised cabin, about the women living there, about the schedules Elizabeth maintained for her sons. He documented the light-skinned children he'd examined, noting their father's identities, their calculated values. He recorded conversations with Elizabeth, where she explained her system with business-like efficiency. And he wrote his own moral revulsion, his shame at witnessing such evil and doing nothing to stop it. Morrison kept these notes in a leather journal he'd been given as a medical school graduation present. On the journal's first page, he wrote the words that researchers would find 127 years later. "May God forgive me for not burning this, but someone must know what I witnessed, even if that knowledge comes a century after my death." He visited Willowmere 3 more times over the next 2 years. Each visit added more entries to his journal. He documented the expansion of Elizabeth's system, the increasing number of women in the supervised cabin, the growing population of mixed-race children. He also documented something else: the psychological destruction of Jonathan and Samuel Crane. Jonathan had essentially stopped speaking except when necessary. He performed his duties in the breeding program with mechanical compliance, but otherwise withdrew completely from life. He didn't attend church. He avoided social gatherings. He spent hours alone writing Willowmere's boundaries as if looking for an escape that didn't exist. Morrison examined him once for persistent headaches and recognized the symptoms of profound depression. The young man was dying inside, killing himself slowly through alcohol and despair, unable to escape the horror he participated in, but unwilling to fully accept it. Samuel had gone in the opposite direction. He'd become cruel, not just participating in the breeding program, but expanding it through his own initiative. He took women outside the supervised cabin, violated field workers, ignored his mother's schedules in favor of his own impulses. He'd also become violent, beating enslaved people for minor infractions, using physical cruelty to assert dominance. Elizabeth tried to control him, worried that his excesses would create problems, but Samuel was beyond her control now. He'd internalized the logic of slavery so completely that he'd become a monster. Morrison documented all of this. He wrote about examining women who showed signs of physical trauma, about treating Sarah after Samuel had beaten her for imagined disrespect, about the fear he saw in every enslaved person's eyes at Willowmere, and he wrote about his own cowardice, his inability to act, his choice to bear witness rather than intervene. There was one entry from June 1847 that would later become particularly significant. Morrison described a conversation with Bethany, the cook who'd been keeping her own mental records. They'd been in the kitchen and Morrison had been treating Bethany for a burned hand. She'd looked at him with eyes that held both intelligence and calculation. "Dr. Morrison," she'd said quietly, "you write things down in that journal, things you see here." Morrison had frozen, terrified that she'd report him to Elizabeth. "How do you know that?" he'd asked. "I see things," she'd replied. "I remember things. I know you come back from visiting and write in that book late at night." She paused. "What you write, is it true? Is it everything?" Morrison had nodded, unable to speak. Bethany had studied him for a long moment. "Then you need to keep it safe," she'd said, "because someday someone needs to know what happened here. Someone needs to remember us. Not just what Mistress Crane did, but that we were people, that we had names, that we mattered." Morrison had promised he would, and he'd kept that promise, preserving his journal through the rest of his life, leaving instructions in his will that it be sealed and donated to the Alabama State Archives after his death. By the summer of 1847, Elizabeth's system had been operating for 5 years. She'd successfully navigated the debt crisis that had threatened Willowmere. Her creditors were being paid on schedule. Her plantation was now valued at over $100,000, with much of that increased value coming from the 89 children born through her breeding program. She'd proven, at least in economic terms, that her methods worked. But success built on horror is inherently unstable. Elizabeth had created a population of enslaved people who hated her with intensity that went beyond Norma L. Plantation relationships. She'd corrupted her sons beyond redemption. She'd built a system that required constant violence to maintain, and she'd attracted attention, the kind of whispered speculation from neighboring plantation owners who wondered exactly how Elizabeth Crane had turned Willow's fortunes around so dramatically. Some of that attention was admiring. Other plantation owners facing their own financial pressures wanted to understand her methods. A few even approached her discreetly, asking for advice about increasing their own enslaved populations through natural means. Elizabeth provided that advice carefully, never explaining the full extent of her system, but offering hints about selection, supervision, and incentive structures. She was in her own mind an innovator sharing best practices. But other attention was darker. There were rumors about the light-skinned children at Willowmere, about the Crane sons' unusual devotion to their mother's plantation, about the supervised cabin and what happened there. Most white people in Dallas County chose to ignore these rumors. The alternative was acknowledging that slavery's logic led exactly where Elizabeth had taken it, and acknowledgement would require either action or complicity. Complicity was easier. The enslaved people at Willowmere didn't have the option of looking away. They lived inside Elizabeth's nightmare every day. And by 1847, some of them were beginning to plan resistance. The resistance didn't start with a plan. It started with a man named Isaiah who'd been at Willowmere for 30 years. He was 52 years old in 1847, too old for field work, assigned instead to maintain the plantation's equipment and buildings. Isaiah couldn't read, but he understood structure. He understood how things were built, how they could be dismantled, how systems that seemed solid could collapse if the right support was removed. Isaiah had watched Elizabeth's breeding program grow from its beginning. He'd seen Jacob's rebellion crushed. He'd witnessed the expansion of the supervised cabin. He'd helped construct the additional rooms Elizabeth ordered built, sawing timber and driving nails into a structure he knew would house horror. And through all of it, he'd been waiting, storing knowledge, looking for weaknesses. By 1847, Isaiah had identified something important. Elizabeth's entire system depended on her son's participation. Without Jonathan and Samuel, the breeding program couldn't function as designed. Elizabeth could hire overseers to force women, but that would be crudder, more visible, harder to maintain with the same systematic efficiency. Her sons were essential tools, which meant her sons were vulnerabilities. Isaiah began talking carefully to other enslaved people at Willowmere, building trust, testing loyalty, identifying who might be willing to risk everything for the possibility of change. He was cautious, knowing that desperation sometimes made people dangerous, that someone might betray a resistance plan in exchange for Elizabeth's favor or just out of fear. But over months, Isaiah assembled a small group of people who understood that survival alone wasn't enough, that some things were worth dying for. Bethany was part of that group. So was Jacob, though his spirit had been broken, and he contributed more as a symbol than an active participant. There was a woman named Clara who worked in the main house, who had access to Elizabeth's study and could report on the mistress's schedules and plans. There was a young man named Daniel who worked in the stables and knew the roads leading away from Willowmere. And there was Ruth, one of the women in the supervised cabin who'd borne 3 children through the breeding program and whose rage had crystallized into something cold and calculating. They didn't plan rebellion in the traditional sense. They couldn't fight armed white men and win. They couldn't escape en masse without being hunted down and killed. But they could sabotage. They could create chaos. They could make Elizabeth's system too costly to maintain. And if they were very careful and very lucky, they might be able to destroy the breeding program itself. The first act of resistance was subtle. Ruth, who'd been tracking her own cycles as carefully as Elizabeth tracked them, began providing false information. She told Elizabeth she was fertile when she wasn't, claimed illness during actual fertile periods, and created enough confusion that the scheduling system became unreliable. Other women in the supervised cabin followed her lead. Within 3 months, the pregnancy rate at Willowmere dropped by nearly half. Elizabeth noticed, but initially attributed it to natural variation. Then Clara, working in the main house, began making small errors in Elizabeth's record-keeping. She moved ledgers so entries were harder to find. She spilled water on pages, making ink run and numbers illegible. She subtly altered dates so Elizabeth's careful tracking system became corrupted. None of these acts were dramatic enough to warrant severe punishment, but cumulatively they degraded the efficiency Elizabeth prized. Isaiah contributed by ensuring that equipment broke more frequently. Plows developed cracks in their blades, wagon wheels lost spokes. The gin mechanism that processed cotton required constant repair. Each breakdown reduced productivity, cost money, and demanded Elizabeth's attention. The plantation that had been running with smooth efficiency suddenly seemed plagued by constant small crises, but the most effective resistance came from an unexpected source. Jonathan Crane began to unravel. By late 1847, he was drinking from morning until night. He missed scheduled sessions with women in the supervised cabin. When Elizabeth confronted him, he became belligerent, shouting that he was done, that he wouldn't participate anymore, that she'd already taken everything from him, and he had nothing left to lose. Elizabeth tried to reassert control the way she had with Jacob through threats and manipulation. But Jonathan wasn't Jacob. He was her son. He held legal rights she couldn't simply override, and his breakdown was becoming public. Neighbors noticed his absence from church. Merchants in Selma mentioned his erratic behavior when he came to town. Elizabeth's carefully maintained reputation was beginning to crack. In November 1847, Jonathan left Willowmere. He rode to Selma in the middle of the night, took a room at a boarding house, and sent a letter to his mother explaining that he was done, that he'd rather starve than continue participating in her program, that she could keep the plantation and everything on it because he wanted no part of it anymore. Elizabeth went to Selma personally to retrieve him. She found Jonathan in his room, drunk, disheveled, barely coherent. She tried reasoning with him, then threatening him, then pleading with him. Nothing worked. Jonathan had reached a breaking point. He told his mother that he'd rather die than go back to Willowmere, and he meant it. Elizabeth returned to the plantation without her eldest son. She told Samuel that he would need to increase his participation to compensate for Jonathan's absence. Samuel agreed readily, perhaps even enthusiastically, but one man couldn't maintain the system as efficiently as two. The breeding program's productivity declined further. Then, in December, something happened that Elizabeth hadn't anticipated. Samuel took a woman named Naomi from the supervised cabin and beat her so severely that she miscarried the child she'd been carrying. Naomi nearly died. Dr. Morrison was called to treat her, and what he found appalled him. He wrote in his journal that the injuries suggested sustained deliberate cruelty, that Samuel Crane had lost whatever minimal restraint he'd once possessed. Morrison confronted Elizabeth after treating Naomi. "Mrs. Crane," he said, "your son is out of control. What he did to that woman goes beyond any justification, even by the standards of this place. If this continues, someone will die. And when that happens, there will be questions you can't answer." Elizabeth dismissed his concerns. Naomi survived, didn't she? No real harm was done. The child she lost can be replaced. Samuel was disciplining a disobedient worker. That's within his rights as overseer. Morrison stared at her, understanding fully for the first time the depth of her moral corruption. She genuinely didn't see the horror of what she'd created. She couldn't see it. Her entire identity was invested in the belief that her system was rational, necessary, justified. The doctor left Willory that day knowing he would never return. He wrote in his journal that night, "I can no longer provide medical care to a plantation that uses my services to perpetuate such evil. I am complicit through my continued participation. May God forgive me for the years I looked away." Without Morrison's medical support, Elizabeth's careful management of pregnancies and childbirths became more difficult. Women died in childbirth at higher rates. Infants died more frequently. The supervised cabin, which had been relatively healthy due to better food and medical care, became as dangerous as the rest of the plantation. The economic efficiency Elizabeth had built began collapsing. By early 1848, Willowmere was in crisis. Jonathan remained in Selma, refusing all contact with his family. Samuel was increasingly violent and unreliable. The enslaved population was engaged in slow, careful sabotage that degraded every aspect of plantation operations, and Elizabeth's creditors were beginning to ask questions about why productivity had declined so dramatically after years of steady growth. Elizabeth tried to regain control through increased violence. She hired brutal overseers who used whips freely. She implemented stricter surveillance. She separated families to punish suspected resistance. But violence only breeds more resistance. More cruel she became, the more determined the enslaved people at Willowmere became to destroy her system, even if destroying it meant their own deaths. In March 1848, there was a fire. It started in the supervised cabin in the middle of the night. The building burned completely, taking with it all of Elizabeth's special accommodations for her breeding program. No one died. The women got out safely, but the message was clear. The enslaved people at Willowmere had moved from passive sabotage to active destruction. Elizabeth had the cabin rebuilt, but it burned again 3 weeks later. After the second fire, she posted guards overnight. The fire stopped, but other acts of resistance continued. Equipment disappeared. Crops were damaged in ways that looked like accidents. The new overseer she'd hired was found unconscious in the barn, beaten so severely he left Willory as soon as he could travel. Isaiah and his resistance group had discovered something powerful. Elizabeth needed them more than they needed her. She couldn't run Willowry without enslaved labor. She couldn't punish everyone without destroying her own labor force. She couldn't maintain control through violence alone because violence required resources and attention she couldn't sustain indefinitely. The balance of power hadn't shifted completely, but it had shifted enough that Elizabeth's system was no longer sustainable. In April 1848, Elizabeth Crane made a decision born of desperation. She announced that the breeding program was ending. The supervised cabin would be demolished. The women there would return to field work. Her sons would no longer be involved in plantation management. Willowry would operate as a traditional cotton plantation without the systematic breeding that had defined it for 6 years. She presented this decision as a voluntary choice, a practical adjustment to changing circumstances. But everyone at Willowmere understood the truth. The enslaved people had won, not completely, not freedom, but they destroyed the specific horror Elizabeth had created. They'd forced her to abandon the system she'd invested years building. It wasn't justice, but it was something. It was proof that resistance was possible, that even enslaved people had power if they were willing to use it. The celebration among the enslaved population was muted and private. They understood that Elizabeth still owned them, that slavery itself continued, that their lives remained brutal and constrained. But they'd removed one specific evil. They'd saved future daughters from the supervised cabin. They demonstrated that even the most carefully designed system of oppression could be dismantled by determined resistance. Bethany, who'd kept mental throughout, added a final entry to her internal testimony. She remembered the fires, the sabotage, the careful coordination that had forced Elizabeth to surrender. She remembered Isaiah's patience, Ruth's courage, Clara's subtle destruction of records. She remembered that resistance had worked, and she held that memory like a promise that someday, somehow, larger resistance might work too. But the story doesn't end with Elizabeth's surrender, because even defeated systems leave damage that persists for generations. And what happened at Willowmere between 1842 and 1848 created consequences that would echo long after the plantation itself disappeared. The children born through Elizabeth's breeding program didn't disappear when the system ended. They remained at Willowry, growing up as enslaved people, but carrying the visible evidence of their origins. By 1850, there were 89 children aged 8 and younger who bore the features of the Crane family: light skin, straight or wavy hair, eyes that reflected their father's bloodlines. They were living reminders of what had happened, human documents of Elizabeth's systematic evil. Elizabeth tried to erase the evidence. She sold some of the older children to distant plantations, separating them from their mothers, scattering them across Alabama and Mississippi so that no single location held too many witnesses. She falsified records, burned ledgers, destroyed documentation that explicitly connected her sons to specific children. She was attempting to bury the truth before it could fully emerge. But memory doesn't erase as easily as paper burns. The enslaved people at Willowmere remembered. They told their children. They passed down stories that named names, that identified fathers and mothers, that preserved testimony even when official records were destroyed. Bethany, still keeping her mental archive, added these new details. The cover-up itself became part of the history that needed preserving. Jonathan never returned to Willowry. He remained in Selma, working odd jobs, drinking heavily, dying slowly of despair and alcohol poisoning. On a February night in 1851, he was found dead in his boarding house room. He was 28 years old. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but everyone who'd known him understood he died of shame, of guilt, of the psychological weight of participating in horrors he couldn't undo or escape. His few possessions were returned to Elizabeth. Among them was a small notebook filled with Jonathan's handwriting. Elizabeth read 3 pages, saw her son's self-recriminations and detailed accounts of the breeding program, and immediately burned it. But not before Clara, who was present when the possessions arrived, glimpsed enough to report to Bethany what it contained. Another document destroyed, another piece of testimony preserved through memory. Samuel remained at Willowmere, but he was a broken man in a different way than Jonathan. The violence he'd embraced had consumed him. By 1850, he was brutal to everyone around him, including white overseers, neighboring planters who visited, even his mother. He'd become someone Elizabeth couldn't control, someone whose cruelty was becoming a liability rather than an asset. In 1852, Samuel beat an enslaved man so severely that the man died. This crossed a line. Even in Alabama, even in a society built on slavery's violence, there were nominal legal constraints on killing enslaved people. They were property, and destroying property had consequences, especially when witnesses existed and rumors spread. Elizabeth had to act quickly to protect her son from prosecution. She sent Samuel to Texas to distant relatives who operated a ranch far from Alabama's plantation society. She paid them to keep him employed and supervised, essentially buying his exile. Samuel left Willowmere in July 1852 and never returned. He died in Texas in 1859, shot in a dispute over a card game, violent until the end. With both her sons gone, Elizabeth faced a fundamental problem. Willowmere required management, and she was aging. She was 54 years old in 1852. Still sharp mentally, but physically declining. The plantation needed oversight she could no longer provide alone. She hired a series of overseers, but none stayed long. Willowmere had a reputation by then. Stories circulated about what had happened there, about the light-skinned children, about the Crane sons, and why they'd left. Decent men didn't want to associate with the plantation. The only overseers Elizabeth could hire were men desperate enough or brutal enough not to care about reputation. The plantation's productivity continued declining. Cotton yields dropped. The enslaved population, emboldened by their successful resistance to the breeding program, worked slowly and carefully, maintaining just enough productivity to avoid severe punishment, but nothing more. They understood that Elizabeth's power was waning. That time was on their side, that the system holding them was weakening. In 1854, Elizabeth suffered a stroke. It left her partially paralyzed, able to speak but with difficulty, able to move but requiring assistance. Her daughter Mary, who'd married and moved to Montgomery in 1848, returned to Willowmere to care for her mother. Mary was 24 years old, and she'd been largely sheltered from the full extent of what Elizabeth had created. She'd known about the breeding program in general terms, but not the systematic details, not the careful records, not the multi-generational planning. When Mary found her mother's remaining ledgers, the ones Elizabeth hadn't destroyed, she was horrified. She read entries that valued children like livestock, that scheduled her brother's participation in systematic rape, that projected profits across generations. She confronted Elizabeth, demanding to know how her mother could have done such things. Elizabeth, struggling with speech, managed to articulate what she'd always believed. It was necessary. It saved the family. It was efficient. Everyone benefits from slavery. I just made it work better. I made us wealthy. I protected you. Mary left the room, unable to respond. She spent days wrestling with what she'd learned, trying to reconcile the mother who'd raised her with the woman who'd orchestrated such calculated evil. Eventually, she reached a conclusion. She couldn't undo what had been done, but she could ensure it was never repeated. She burned the remaining ledgers, all of them, every document that detailed Elizabeth's system, every record that connected specific children to their fathers, everything. Mary believed she was protecting her family's reputation. She thought she was showing mercy to the children by eliminating proof of their origins. But what she actually did was destroy evidence that would later be crucial for understanding what had happened at Willowmere, for establishing the full scope of Elizabeth's crimes, for giving descendants the documentation they deserved. Bethany watched Mary burn the ledgers. She understood what was being lost. That night, she gathered the other enslaved people who'd been part of the resistance and told them, "The written records are gone. Now memory is all we have. Remember, burn everything. Tell your children. Make them promise to tell theirs. Don't let this be forgotten just because they burned the papers." Elizabeth Crane died in November 1856. She was 52 years old. The funeral was small. Jonathan was dead. Samuel was in Texas. Mary attended but left immediately afterward, returning to Montgomery and never visiting Willowmere again. The neighboring planters who'd once envied Elizabeth's success stayed away. She was buried in the Crane family plot beneath a simple headstone that listed her name and dates with no epitaph, no praise, no mention of her accomplishments. Even in death, there was something about Willowmere that people wanted to distance themselves from. Mary sold Willowmere in 1857 to a cotton merchant from Mobile. She sold it quickly below market value, desperate to be rid of it. The new owner knew nothing of its history. He operated it as a conventional plantation until 1865, when the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished. The enslaved people at Willowmere became free, joining the massive displacement of formerly enslaved people trying to navigate a South that granted them legal freedom. But little else. Many stayed in Dallas County, working as sharecroppers, surviving in poverty that was barely distinguishable from slavery, except for the technical legality of their status. Some headed north, seeking opportunities in cities where their past might not follow them. A few, including Bethany, became part of the Freedmen's Bureau efforts, testifying about their experiences, trying to help other formerly enslaved people navigate freedom. Bethany was 45 years old when freedom came. She kept her mental records for 23 years, remembering dates and names and details with remarkable precision. In 1866, she gave testimony to a Freedmen's Bureau investigator about conditions at Willowmere. She described the breeding program, named Elizabeth Crane as its architect, identified Jonathan and Samuel as participants, and listed the names of women who'd been forced into the supervised cabin. Her testimony was recorded in a report filed with the Bureau. It sat in an archive in Washington, D.C., largely unread, one document among thousands describing slavery's horrors, but it existed. Bethany had succeeded in creating a permanent record even after Elizabeth's careful documentation had been destroyed. The other crucial document was Dr. Morrison's journal. Morrison died in 1872 and his papers were donated to the Alabama State Archives according to his will's instructions. The journal was sealed at his request, not to be opened until 1974, a century after his death. Morrison wanted the truth preserved, but delayed, giving everyone directly involved time to die before the horror became public knowledge. For 100 years, Willowier's story existed only in scattered fragments, in the memories of descendants who'd been told stories by grandparents who'd survived the plantation. In Bethy's testimony buried in Freedmen's Bureau archives, in Morrison's sealed journal, in the oral histories that African American families preserved carefully, knowing that written history often excluded their experiences. Then in 1974, researchers opened Morrison's journal. What they found was a detailed contemporaneous account of Elizabeth Crane's breeding program written by a white doctor who'd witnessed it directly. Morrison's clinical descriptions combined with his moral horror created a document that was both evidential and damning. The journal confirmed what formerly enslaved people had been saying for a century. It provided documentation that made denial impossible. The researchers cross-referenced Morrison's journal with other archives. They found Bethy's Freedmen's Bureau testimony. They located property records showing Willowier's ownership history. They tracked down descendants of people who'd been enslaved there, collecting oral histories that matched Morrison's written account with remarkable consistency. Slowly, carefully, they reconstructed what had happened at Willowmere between 1842 and 1848. The story became public in 1977 when a historian named Dr. Patricia Reynolds published an article in the Journal of Southern History titled Systematic Breeding and Family Corruption: The Willow-Ree Plantation Case, 1842-1848. The article was explosive. It documented everything: Elizabeth's debt crisis, her decision to use her sons in a breeding program, the supervised cabin, the resistance that eventually destroyed the system, the aftermath. Reynolds's article sparked intense debate. Some scholars questioned whether the evidence was sufficient, whether Morrison's journal might be exaggerated, whether oral histories collected a century after events could be reliable. But most historians recognized the documentation's strength. Multiple sources, including both white and black testimony, contemporary and retrospective accounts, all telling consistent stories. Willow-Ree had happened exactly as described. The publication also affected descendants. Some welcomed the historical recognition, feeling that their ancestors' suffering was finally being acknowledged. Others found the exposure painful, struggling with the public knowledge that their family history included systematic rape and forced breeding. There was no easy way to process such revelation, no clean resolution to trauma that had echoed across generations. What happened at Willowmere wasn't unique. Similar programs existed on other plantations, though rarely documented as thoroughly. Elizabeth Crane's innovation wasn't inventing the breeding of enslaved people that happened throughout the South, but systematizing it, applying business logic to violation, using her own sons as tools, and maintaining records that expose the calculated nature of slavery, sexual violence. The Willow-Ree story forces confrontation with uncomfortable truths: that slavery wasn't just labor exploitation, but systematic destruction of families, bodies, and identities; that even familial bonds could be corrupted by slavery's logic; that women like Elizabeth Crane could orchestrate horror while believing themselves practical and moral; that systems of oppression persist not just through violence but through everyone's complicity, through the choice to look away, to not ask questions, to accept comfortable lies rather than demanding difficult truths. The site where Willowmere stood is now farmland cotton still growing in the same soil where enslaved people once worked. There's no historical marker, no memorial, nothing to indicate what happened there. Most people driving past have no idea that this quiet stretch of Alabama countryside was once the location of systematic horror. The physical evidence is gone, but the documentary evidence remains, preserved in archives where researchers continue studying it, trying to understand not just what happened, but why, and what it reveals about American history's darkest chapters. Here at the Sealed Room, we don't tell these stories for entertainment. We tell them because forgetting the dead means killing them twice. Because comfortable narratives about the past require uncomfortable truths as their correction. because understanding how evil systems functioned is essential to preventing their recurrence. Elizabeth Crane believed her system was rational, necessary, justified. She was wrong, but her confidence in her own righteousness should terrify us because it reveals how easily humans rationalize horror when it serves their interests. The children born through Willamere's breeding program had descendants. Those descendants are alive today, carrying genetic and historical legacies of what Elizabeth Crane created. Some know their history, others don't. The stories lost as families moved, as generations passed, as trauma proved too painful to discuss. But the history exists whether individuals know it or not, shaping lives in ways both visible and invisible. What do we do with such knowledge? How do we reckon with evil that was legal in its time but unconscionable by any moral standard? How do we honor victims while acknowledging the complexity of survival and resistance? There are no easy answers, but the first step is remembering, bearing witness, refusing to let horror be sanitized into comfortable historical narratives that exclude the voices of those who suffered most. Bethany spent 23 years keeping mental records because she understood something fundamental. Memory is resistance. Testimony is power. The act of remembering, of preserving truth, even when documentation is destroyed, even when systems try to enforce forgetting, that act is itself a form of justice, imperfect justice, incomplete justice, but justice nonetheless. If you've made it to the end of this story, you're now a witness too. You know what happened at Willowmere. You know what Elizabeth Crane created and what the enslaved people there destroyed through careful, courageous resistance. You know that American history includes horrors we're still learning to confront honestly. What you do with that knowledge matters. Share this story. Talk about it. Let it challenge your assumptions about the past and the present. Because systems of oppression don't disappear, they evolve. And understanding their historical forms helps us recognize their contemporary manifestations. Subscribe if you believe the darkest truths deserve the brightest light. Share this with someone who needs to understand that history's horrors were real, were systematic, and were perpetrated by people who believed themselves righteous. And remember the names. Remember Bethany, who kept faith that truth would matter. Remember Isaiah, who organized resistance when resistance seemed impossible. Remember Jacob, who chose his daughter's survival even at the cost of his own spirit. Remember all the people whose names we don't know, who suffered at Willowmere and whose testimony has been lost, but humanity remains. The truth is patient. It waits in archives. It lives in descendants' memories. It survives in stories that refuse to die, and eventually always it emerges. What happened at Willowy Plantation between 1842 and 1848 was real. Elizabeth Crane was real. The systematic breeding program was real, the resistance was real, the aftermath was real, and the obligation to remember is real too. Thank you for bearing witness. Thank you for not looking away. Thank you for understanding that some stories must be told, no matter how painful, because the alternative to difficult truth is comfortable lies. And comfortable lies are how evil systems persist across generations. Cross generations. Cross generations. Cross generations. Cross generations. Cross generations. Cross generations.